The rain drummed against the ranch house windows like impatient fingers, each droplet catching the amber glow of the kerosene lamp Sam had lit when the power went out an hour ago. He sat across from Elena at the scarred pine table that had served him solitary meals for the better part of 2 decades, watching her cradle a steaming mug of coffee between hands that trembled despite the warmth. The twins slept on his couch, wrapped in quilts his late wife Margaret had sewn before they were born, before everything went to hell on that December night in 1967. The little boy had his thumb in his mouth, dark hair curling against his forehead, in exactly the same pattern Sam remembered from his own children. The girl lay with one small fist pressed against her cheek, breathing with the deep rhythm of exhaustion. "They're beautiful," Sam said, his voice rougher than he intended. Elena's unseeing eyes turned toward the living room as if she could see through the doorway. "Michael and Sarah, they're 3. She lifted the mug to her lips, and Sam noticed the wedding ring on her finger, a simple gold band worn thin with time. "They don't understand why we had to leave." "Leave where?" Sam leaned back in his chair, the familiar creak of old wood filling the silence between thunder rolls. "Elena, I need to understand what happened to you, how you got in that mine shaft, why you were bleeding." He paused, studying the woman who'd appeared like something out of a fever dream. "How you knew to call me by name." She set down the coffee and touched the bandage he'd applied to the gash on her forehead. The bleeding had stopped, but she'd need proper medical attention once the storm passed and the roads cleared. "You won't believe me." "Try me." Sam had lived long enough to know that the world held mysteries deeper than a man's understanding. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, in the twisted metal of a station wagon on an icy mountain road, holding his wife's hand as the life drained out of her while his boys lay silent in the back seat. Elena was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Outside, the storm raged with biblical intensity, the kind of weather that turned dry creek beds into death traps and forced creatures to seek shelter wherever they could find it, just like Elena and her children had done. "I was driving," she said finally. It was snowing, and the roads were slick. Michael was crying in the back seat because he'd forgotten his favorite truck at the babysitter's, and Sarah was singing that lullaby. You know the one. "Sleep, my darling, close your eyes underneath these starlit skies." Her voice cracked on the words. "I told them we'd go back for the truck in the morning, that everything would be all right." Sam's blood turned cold. Those were Margaret's words, Margaret's lullaby. He'd never told anyone about that song, about how she'd made it up when the twins were babies and couldn't sleep. "The truck came out of nowhere," Elena continued, her fingers gripping the coffee mug until her knuckles went white. "I swerved, but the car started spinning, and then we were rolling, and I couldn't stop it, couldn't save them." Tears tracked down her cheeks, glistening in the lamplight. "When I woke up, I couldn't see anything. The doctors said the trauma to my optic nerve was irreversible. But Sam, the children—" "Stop." The word came out harsher than he meant, but Sam couldn't listen to any more. The parallels were too close, too precise. It was like hearing his own nightmares spoken aloud by a stranger. "This isn't possible. What you're describing, it happened to my family, my wife, my children, not yours." Elena turned toward him again, and even blind, her gaze seemed to pin him in place. "What if they're the same thing, Sam? What if there are places where time doesn't work the way we think it does, where love creates bridges across impossible distances?" Thunder crashed overhead, and the old house shuddered. In the living room, one of the children whimpered in sleep, a sound so achingly familiar that Sam had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. He'd spent 20 years building walls around his grief, 20 years of isolation and guilt and careful numbness. He'd convinced himself that solitude was safer than hope, that accepting his loss was better than questioning the cruel mathematics of chance that had taken his family while leaving him behind. But now this woman sat in his kitchen, speaking impossible truths and tending impossible children, asking him to believe in something his rational mind rejected, even as his heart yearned for it to be real. "The roads will be clear by morning," Sam said, standing abruptly. "I'll drive you to town then. There's a doctor, and someone who can help you figure out where you belong." Elena nodded, but her expression remained unchanged. Of course, whatever you think is best. As Sam headed for his bedroom, he could feel her listening to his footsteps, as if she were memorizing the sound of his retreat. Sam lay in his narrow bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, while the storm spent its fury against his windows. Sleep hadn't come easily in 20 years, but tonight felt different. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elena's face, heard Michael's whimper from the living room, felt the ghost of Sarah's small hand against his weathered palm when he'd helped them from his truck. He'd built this life deliberately, constructed it like a fence to keep the world at arm's length. The Broken Arrow Ranch sat 40 miles from the nearest town, connected to civilization by a single dirt road that became impassable in weather like this. Sam told himself he preferred it that way. No unexpected visitors, no well-meaning neighbors dropping by with casseroles and pitying looks. Just him, his cattle, and the endless work that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. By 4:30, he gave up on sleep and pulled on his jeans and boots. The storm had moved east, leaving behind the crystalline silence that always followed hard rain in the high desert. Sam stepped onto his porch, breathing air so clean it hurt his lungs, and surveyed his domain in the pre-dawn darkness. The ranch stretched 3,000 acres in every direction, rolling grassland punctuated by arroyos and red rock formations that caught fire when the sun hit them right. His grandfather had homesteaded this land in 1889, and 3 generations of Garretts had carved out a living from soil that fought back with every season. Sam's father had built the main house where Elena and the children now slept, had planted the cottonwoods that formed a windbreak on the north side, had dug the well that still provided the sweetest water in the county. Sam had inherited it all when his parents died. The land, the responsibilities, the crushing weight of carrying on alone. He'd been ranch foreman for old Bill Patterson then, learning the business while Margaret kept their books and raised their boys. They'd had plans, expand the herd, modernize the operation, maybe build a new barn. Simple dreams for simple people who thought they had time. He walked to the horse pasture where his 3 remaining animals stood silhouetted against the lightning sky. Durango, his black gelding, whickered softly and trotted over to investigate Sam's empty hands. The horse was getting old, like everything else on the ranch, but Sam couldn't bring himself to replace him. Durango had belonged to his son Tommy, had carried the boy across these same hills during weekend camping trips and summer adventures that now felt like scenes from someone else's life. "Just you and me again, old friend," Sam murmured, scratching the horse's neck. Durango leaned into the touch, and Sam wondered when he'd become the kind of man who talked to animals, because they were the only creatures who'd listen. The morning routine unfolded with mechanical precision: feed the horses, check the automatic waterers, inspect the fence line for storm damage. His nearest neighbor lived 15 miles south, and they spoke perhaps twice a year when business demanded it. The mailman came once a week, leaving bills and agricultural journals in the rusty box by the road. Dr. Martinez in town saw him annually for a physical he neither wanted nor needed. These constituted the sum total of Sam's human contact, and he'd convinced himself it was enough. But as he worked, he found himself listening for sounds from the house: a child's laughter, Elena's voice, the domestic music of a family waking up. The silence felt different now, not peaceful but hollow, like the echo in an empty church. Sam had money in the bank, more than he needed. The ranch turned a modest profit, and his needs were simple: coffee, canned goods, feed for the animals, fuel for the truck. He could afford to hire help, maybe even sell to developers who'd been circling like vultures, offering astronomical sums for prime residential acreage. But money couldn't fill the spaces that grief had carved out of his chest. Money couldn't make the house feel less empty or the nights less long. He'd been 28 when the accident happened, young enough to start over. Well-meaning friends had suggested he remarry, find a good woman who might give him more children. The advice felt like blasphemy then and seemed impossible now. How did a man explain that his heart had been buried with his family, that love felt like a language he'd forgotten how to speak? By the time Sam returned to the house, full daylight painted the kitchen golden. Elena sat at the table where he'd left her, but she'd found his coffee pot and made fresh brew. The children were awake, sitting quietly on the floor and playing with wooden blocks Sam didn't remember owning until he realized they were the same blocks he'd carved for his own boys 30 years ago, stored in a closet he never opened. "Good morning," Elena said without turning around. "I hope you don't mind. We're early risers." Sarah looked up from her blocks and smiled at Sam with Margaret's eyes. And for one devastating moment, he felt the walls he'd built around his heart begin to crack. Sam stood frozen in the doorway, his work-roughened hands gripping the door frame as Sarah's smile pierced through 20 years of carefully constructed defenses. The wooden blocks scattered across his kitchen floor seemed to mock the emptiness he'd cultivated, each hand-carved animal and letter a testament to the father he'd once been. "Where did you find those?" His voice came out strangled, barely above a whisper. Elena's head tilted toward him, her blind eyes somehow finding his location with unsettling precision. "The children found them in a box in the hall closet. I hope that's all right. They were restless, and I could hear you working outside." Michael looked up from where he'd been building a tower with the alphabet blocks, his small face serious with concentration. "Look, mister, I made a castle." The boy held up his creation, and Sam's knees nearly buckled. It was the same design Tommy used to build, the same pattern his son had constructed every morning at this very table while Margaret made breakfast and hummed her lullabies. "That's—" Sam cleared his throat, stepping into the kitchen on unsteady legs. "That's real good, son." The endearment slipped out before he could stop it, and Elena's sharp intake of breath told him she'd heard. Her fingers tightened around her coffee mug, and for a moment the only sound was the twins' quiet play and the tick of the wall clock that had counted every empty hour of Sam's exile. He poured himself coffee with hands that shook, using the simple task to avoid looking at the scene that shouldn't exist. But avoidance had never been his nature. And when he finally turned back, Sarah was standing beside his chair, one small hand reaching toward his weathered face with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Why are you sad, Mr. Sam?" she asked, her voice carrying Margaret's musical cadence. "Mama says sadness lives in people when they lose someone they love very much." Sam's coffee mug hit the table harder than he intended, hot liquid sloshing over the rim. Elena had gone perfectly still, her unseeing gaze fixed on her daughter with an expression of shock that mirrored Sam's own devastation. "Sarah, come back and play with your brother," Elena said quietly. But the little girl ignored her mother, studying Sam with those impossible familiar eyes. "You lost someone, didn't you? That's why this house feels so quiet." Sarah's small hand finally made contact with Sam's cheek, her touch gentle and warm. "Mama lost someone too. That's why she cries at night when she thinks we're sleeping." Sam couldn't breathe. The child's words hit him like physical blows, each observation cutting through the scar tissue around his heart with surgical precision. He pulled back from her touch, his chair scraping against the floor as he stood abruptly. "Elena, we need to talk. Outside." He headed for the door without waiting for her response, his vision tunneling as panic clawed at his chest. Behind him, he heard Elena murmuring to the children, her voice strained but gentle. She found him on the porch 5 minutes later, moving with the careful steps of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. Sam had positioned himself against the railing, staring out at his land while his hands gripped the weathered wood hard enough to leave splinters in his palms. "She's never done that before," Elena said, settling into the chair beside where he stood. "Sarah doesn't usually approach strangers. She's always been shy, cautious with people she doesn't know." "How old did you say they were?" 3. "They'll be 4 in December." Elena's voice carried a weight that spoke of birthday celebrations that would never come, of milestones measured in loss rather than joy. "December 21st, Sam said, the words falling from his lips like stones. "Winter solstice." Elena's sharp gasp confirmed what he already knew, what his rational mind refused to accept. "How did you—" "Because that was my boy's birthday." Sam turned to face her, seeing his own desperate confusion reflected in her sightless eyes. Tommy and Michael, born December 21st, 1964. They'd be 26 now if— He couldn't finish the sentence. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither dared voice. Inside the house, the children's laughter drifted through the screen door, a sound so achingly familiar that Sam felt something fundamental shift in his chest, like a bone setting after years of being broken. "This isn't possible," he whispered. Elena reached out, her fingers finding his arm with unerring accuracy. "I know, but Sam, what if impossible is just another word for something we don't understand yet? What if there are debts the universe pays in ways we never thought to imagine?" Through the window, Sam could see Michael building another tower while Sarah sorted blocks by color with intense concentration. They moved with the easy synchronization of twins, anticipating each other's needs, sharing silent communications that spoke of bonds deeper than words. "I was going to take you to town today," Sam said, his voice hollow. "Find someone to help you, figure out where you belong." "I know." Elena's grip on his arm tightened. "The question is, what are you going to do now?" Sam pulled away from Elena's touch, as if her fingers burned. The rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him functional for 20 years, screamed at him to load them all in the truck immediately and drive straight to town, no matter what the roads looked like. But his feet remained planted on the porch boards his grandfather had laid by hand, and his eyes kept drifting back to the window where impossible children played with toys carved by his own hands decades ago. "I can't do this," he said, more to himself than to Elena. "I won't." "Do what?" Sam turned away from her, focusing on the horizon where heat shimmer made the distant mountains dance. "Whatever this is, whatever game you're playing, whatever con you're running—" "You think I'm lying?" Elena's voice carried hurt, but underneath it lay something harder, more dangerous. "You think I somehow researched your family history, found 2 children who match your son's ages and birthdays, blinded myself, and orchestrated getting trapped in a mine shaft during a flash flood just to— What, steal from you? Take advantage of a lonely old man?" The accusations sounded ridiculous when spoken aloud, but Sam clung to them anyway. Conspiracy was easier to accept than the alternative. Stranger things have happened. Have they? Elena stood, her hand trailing along the porch railing until she found the post. "Tell me, Sam, in all your years of living, have you ever encountered anything stranger than perfect strangers who know your wife's lullaby? Children who play exactly like your sons did? A woman who can navigate your house in the dark as if she's lived here before?" That last observation hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't noticed it consciously, but Elena did move through his house with unsettling familiarity. She'd found the coffee pot without searching, had somehow known the bathroom was down the hall to the left, had located the wooden blocks in a closet he'd sealed shut 20 years ago. "People adapt quickly," he said weakly. "Blind people develop other senses." "Do they develop the ability to know that you keep your coffee in the freezer? That the 3rd floorboard from the kitchen door creaks? That there's a loose banister rail exactly 42 inches from the bottom of the staircase?" Elena's voice remained level, but each word felt like a hammer blow against his carefully constructed reality. "I know these things, Sam. I know them the way you know your own breathing." Inside the house, Michael started crying. Not the frustrated wail of a tired toddler, but the specific hiccuping sob that Tommy used to make when he'd hurt himself and was trying to be brave about it. Sam's body moved before his mind could protest, carrying him through the screen door and into the kitchen where he found the boy clutching his finger, tears streaming down his face. "I pinched it," Michael sobbed, holding up his hand. "In the blocks." Without thinking, Sam knelt and gently examined the finger. No real damage, just a minor pinch that would sting for a few minutes. "You're all right, buddy. Let's get some ice on it." He lifted Michael onto his hip exactly the way he used to carry Tommy, the motion so natural and familiar that 20 years collapsed into nothing. Michael's weight against his chest, the smell of his hair, the way the boy's sobs slowly subsided into sniffles. It was like stepping into a memory so vivid, it felt more real than the present. "Better?" Sam asked, pressing a dish towel full of ice chips against the small finger. Michael nodded, his dark eyes studying Sam's face with unnerving intensity. "You're good at fixing things." "Used to be," Sam murmured, and realized he was still holding the boy, still cradling him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Sarah had materialized beside them, her small hand resting protectively on her brother's leg, and for one crystalline moment, Sam felt complete in a way he'd forgotten was possible. Then reality crashed back in. This wasn't his family. These weren't his children. This was some cosmic joke, some cruel trick designed to tear open wounds that had never properly healed. He set Michael down more abruptly than necessary, the boy's confused expression cutting him deeper than any blade. "Elena, we're leaving, now. Pack whatever you need." "Sam," I said now. He couldn't look at the children, couldn't bear to see the hurt and confusion in their faces. "I'll warm up the truck." Outside, Sam gripped the steering wheel of his old Ford until his knuckles went white. 20 years ago, he'd made a promise to himself in a hospital corridor that reeked of disinfectant and despair. Never again would he open his heart to loss. Never again would he allow hope to take root in the barren soil of his grief. These people, whoever they really were, threatened everything he'd built to protect himself. The walls, the isolation, the careful numbness that kept him functional. He couldn't afford to believe in miracles, even if every instinct he possessed was screaming that he'd found one. The truck's engine turned over on the third try, coughing to life like an old man waking from troubled sleep. Sam kept his hands on the wheel, staring through the windshield at nothing while the Ford warmed up with its familiar symphony of rattles and hums. He could end this now. Drive them to town, hand them over to social services or the church ladies who specialized in helping folks in need, and return to his carefully ordered solitude. The screen door's familiar squeak made him close his eyes. Elena emerged first, carrying what looked like the same small bundle she'd clutched in the mine shaft. Behind her, the twins moved with the uncertain shuffle of children who sensed adult tension without understanding its source. Michael's finger was wrapped in one of Margaret's old dish towels. Sam recognized the faded blue flowers she'd loved so much. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, as Elena helped her into the truck's cab. The little girl's voice carried the same note of brave uncertainty that Margaret had used during her final hospital stay, when she'd asked the doctors about going home, even though they all knew she never would. "Into town," Sam replied, not trusting himself to look at her. "To find you a proper place to stay." Elena settled between the children, her silence more damning than any accusation. Sam put the truck in gear and started down the dirt road that led away from everything he'd built to protect himself. The morning sun painted the high desert in shades of gold and red, beautiful enough to break hearts if a man let it. They'd traveled maybe 2 miles when Michael spoke up. "Mr. Sam? Are you mad at us?" The question hit Sam like a sucker punch. In the rearview mirror, he could see the boy's worried expression, so achingly familiar it made his chest tight. "No, son, I'm not mad at you." "Then why are we leaving?" "I liked the castle blocks." Sam's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Those blocks had been stored away for 20 years, wrapped in one of Margaret's quilts and buried in a closet he'd sealed like a tomb. He'd carved each one during Margaret's pregnancy, working by lamplight while she slept, creating alphabet letters and simple shapes for the sons who would never grow old enough to read them. "Sometimes people need to find their own place," Sam said, hating how hollow the words sounded. "Their own family." "But—" Sarah started to protest, then stopped abruptly. Sam glanced over and saw her staring at him with those impossible eyes, as if she could see straight through his carefully constructed lies. "You're scared," she said simply. Elena's sharp intake of breath filled the cab's sudden silence. "Sarah, that's enough." "But it's true, Mama." He's scared like you get scared when you dream about the bright place." Sarah's matter-of-fact tone made the observation even more devastating. The place where people go when they can't come back. Sam's foot found the brake without conscious direction, bringing the truck to a stop in the middle of the empty road. His hands shook as he shifted into park, and for a long moment the only sound was the engine's idle and the hammering of his own heart. "How?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "How does she know these things?" Elena's hand found his arm, her touch gentle but insistent. "I don't know. But Sam, maybe the question isn't how. Maybe it's why. Why now? Why us? Why you?" Through the windshield, Sam could see the road stretching ahead, toward town, toward safety, toward the life he'd built from the ashes of his grief. Behind them lay his ranch, empty rooms that had echoed with 20 years of silence, a future as barren as the desert in drought. Michael climbed over his mother's lap and pressed his small hands against Sam's shoulder, the gesture so natural and trusting it nearly undid him. "Please don't leave us, Mr. Sam. We don't got nowhere else to go." The boy's words shattered something fundamental inside Sam's chest. He turned in his seat and really looked at them for the first time since leaving the house. Elena with her bandaged head and fierce protective love, Sarah with her ancient eyes and gentle wisdom, Michael with his brave little heart wrapped in a 3-year-old's body. They weren't just lost strangers anymore. They were something far more dangerous. They were hope. Sam closed his eyes and felt 20 years of careful numbness crack and fall away like ice in spring sun. When he opened them again, his decision was made, not by his head, which screamed warnings about heartbreak and loss, but by something deeper, something that had been sleeping since the night his world ended in twisted metal and broken glass. "Hold on," he said quietly, putting the truck in reverse. "We're going home." The words felt strange on his lips, rusty from disuse. But as he turned the Ford around and headed back toward the ranch, Sam Garrett crossed a threshold he'd thought sealed forever. He chose love over safety, hope over certainty. He chose to believe in impossible things. The drive back to the ranch passed in weighted silence, each of them lost in the gravity of what had just occurred. Sam kept stealing glances at the rearview mirror, watching Elena's face for some sign of what she was thinking. Her expression remained unreadable, but her hand rested protectively on Michael's knee, while Sarah leaned against her other shoulder, and something in that simple tableau made his throat tight. When they pulled up to the house, Sam cut the engine and sat for a moment, wondering what the hell he'd just committed himself to. The smart part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive and functioning for 20 years, was already cataloguing everything that could go wrong. But that voice seemed smaller now, drowned out by something he'd thought died with his family. "Are we staying?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence with her uncanny ability to voice what everyone was thinking. "For now," Sam said, and felt the words settle into his bones like a decision he couldn't take back. Inside, the house felt different somehow, as if the walls themselves had shifted to accommodate these new lives within them. The twins returned to their blocks with the easy resilience of children, but Sam noticed how they stayed closer together now, their play more subdued. Elena moved to the window, her fingers trailing along the sill as she seemed to listen to something only she could hear. "There's something you need to know," she said without turning around, "about why we were in that mine shaft." Sam poured himself coffee, his hands steadier now that the decision was made. "I'm listening. We weren't alone out there." Elena's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Someone's been following us, hunting us maybe. I don't know who they are or what they want, but they've been tracking us for weeks." The coffee turned bitter in Sam's mouth. "What kind of people? The kind that don't ask questions first." Elena finally turned from the window, her face pale. "3 men, maybe 4. They found us at a shelter in Roswell 2 weeks ago. We barely got away." Sam set his mug down harder than necessary, coffee sloshing onto Margaret's old tablecloth. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because you were already looking for reasons to get rid of us. I hoped we'd lost them in the storm." Elena's hands twisted together, the first sign of genuine fear he'd seen from her. But this morning, while you were outside, I heard an engine, distant but wrong somehow, not like yours." The implications hit Sam like cold water. If someone was hunting Elena and the children, bringing them back to his ranch hadn't just been an emotional decision, it had been a tactical error. His property was isolated, defensible in some ways, but also cut off from help. And now he'd just made himself part of whatever this was. "Sarah, Michael," he called to the children, his voice carefully calm. "Why don't you take those blocks upstairs to play? There's a big room up there with lots of space to build." The twins looked between him and their mother, their preternatural awareness picking up on the tension, but they obeyed, gathering their toys with quiet efficiency that spoke of practice at disappearing when adults needed to talk about dangerous things. Once they were gone, Sam moved to the window Elena had been watching from. His property stretched for miles in every direction, mostly open ground with scattered scrub and a few rocky outcroppings that could hide a man if he knew what he was doing. The access road was visible for the first mile before it curved around a hill, giving him early warning of visitors, but also limiting escape routes. "Tell me everything," he said, "from the beginning." Elena sank into one of the kitchen chairs, suddenly looking fragile in a way that had nothing to do with her injuries. "I wish I could, but there are gaps in my memory. I know we were living in Albuquerque before this started. I had a job, an apartment, normal life. Then one day I woke up and nothing made sense anymore. The children were there, but I couldn't remember. I couldn't remember having them." Sam's blood chilled. "What do you remember?" "Fragments, images, being in a hospital, but not as a patient. White corridors, people in uniforms asking questions I couldn't answer. And then we were running, always running, with these men behind us like shadows that never quite catch up, but never fall behind either." She looked up at him with those sightless eyes that seemed to see too much. "I know how it sounds, but Sam, whatever's happening to us, whoever those men are, they're not going to stop. And now that we're here, you're part of it too." From upstairs came the soft sound of blocks being stacked, innocent and domestic against the weight of Elena's words. Sam thought of his gun cabinet, locked for 20 years but still functional, thought of the high ground behind the house, the sight lines, the ways in and out of this place he'd called sanctuary. "Then we'd better get ready," he said, surprising himself with how easily the words came. "Because this is my land, and I don't take kindly to uninvited guests." Elena's revelation hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire, acrid and inescapable. Sam moved away from the window, his mind already shifting into patterns he'd thought buried with his past, calculating angles, assessing vulnerabilities, preparing for violence he'd hoped never to face again. "How long do we have?" he asked, opening the kitchen drawer where Margaret used to keep her recipe cards. His fingers found the spare key hidden beneath them, small and cold against his palm. "I don't know. Could be hours, could be days." Elena's voice carried the weight of someone who'd learned to live with constant uncertainty. "They're patient, methodical. They don't rush in, they wait until you're comfortable, until you think you're safe." Sam pocketed the key and moved toward the hallway. "Stay here. Keep the children quiet." The gun cabinet stood in what had once been his study, now a repository for dust and memories. 20 years of neglect had left the lock stiff, but the key still turned. Inside, wrapped in an old hunting jacket, lay his 30-06 rifle and A45 pistol he'd carried in Vietnam. Both were clean, well-maintained from habit, even through his years of self-imposed exile from violence. The weight of the rifle in his hands brought back muscle memory he'd tried to forget, the smooth action of checking the chamber, the familiar heft of ammunition, the cold mathematics of range and trajectory. He loaded both weapons with methodical precision, his hands steady despite the tremor of old ghosts awakening. When he returned to the kitchen, Elena had moved to stand near the bottom of the stairs, her posture rigid with listening. "They're still playing," she said softly. "Still safe." Sam set the pistol on the kitchen table and leaned the rifle against the counter. "These men who are following you, what do they want?" "Wish I knew." Elena's fingers found the edge of the table, gripping it like an anchor. In the fragments, I remember, they kept asking about before. About what happened before I woke up in that hospital room. But I don't remember a before, Sam. It's like my life started the day I found myself running with two children I somehow love more than my own existence. The impossibility of it struck Sam anew. A woman with no memory, children who shouldn't exist, pursuers with unknown motives, and at the center of it all, details about his dead family that defied explanation. He thought of Sarah's knowing eyes, Michael's familiar gestures, Elena's uncanny navigation of his house. The children, he said carefully. You said you don't remember having them, but you know them. You love them. From the moment I saw them, yes. It was instant, absolute, like recognizing something I'd lost and found again. Elena's voice broke slightly. Does that make sense? It made more sense than Sam wanted to admit. Upstairs, the sound of wooden blocks clicking together mixed with soft voices, Sarah explaining something to her brother in the patient tone of an older sister. The domesticity of it was almost unbearable. We need supplies, Sam said, forcing himself to focus on practical matters. Water, food that'll keep, medical kit. He paused, studying Elena's face. You said you heard an engine this morning. From which direction? Elena tilted her head, concentrating. South, I think, toward the main road, but not on it. Like someone was scouting from a distance. That matched Sam's assessment. The high ground to the south offered good observation points while staying hidden from the house. If their pursuers were professional, and Elena's description suggested they were, they'd have established surveillance before making any move. There's a root cellar beneath the kitchen, he said. Old storm shelter from when this place was built. If things go bad, you take the children down there and wait. What about you? Sam picked up the pistol, checking its weight one more time. I'll be making sure they know they picked the wrong ranch to visit uninvited. From upstairs came a sudden thud, followed by Michael's delighted laughter, the sound of blocks tumbling and joy in simple destruction. It was such a normal sound, such a perfectly ordinary moment of childhood happiness, that it struck Sam like a physical blow. For 20 years he'd lived in a house of silence, a monument to grief where dust gathered on dreams and hope went to die. Now these walls rang with life again. Children's voices, a woman's presence, the complex harmony of a family, even if that family existed outside the bounds of possibility. Elena seemed to sense his thoughts. I know this is asking too much. We have no right to bring danger to your home. It stopped being just my home the moment I decided to come back, Sam replied. And I've been running from ghosts for 20 years. Maybe it's time I stopped running and faced whatever's hunting us. Outside, a hawk circled high above the desert, riding thermals in lazy spirals. Sam watched it through the window and thought about predators and prey, about the difference between surviving and living. He'd survived for 2 decades. Now, with impossible children playing upstairs and danger approaching across the desert, he was finally ready to live again, even if it killed him. The first sign came at dusk, a glint of sunlight off metal where no metal should be, high on the southern ridge that overlooked his property. Sam caught it through the kitchen window while heating soup for the children, just a flash among the scrub oak that could have been anything, could have been nothing. But 20 years of solitude had taught him to trust his instincts, and every nerve in his body was screaming danger. Elena, he said quietly, not moving from the window, take the children downstairs, now. She didn't question him, didn't ask for explanations. Within seconds, he heard her calling softly to Sarah and Michael, her voice carefully cheerful as she suggested a game of hide-and-seek in the special room beneath the kitchen. The children's footsteps crossed overhead, then descended the hidden stairs Sam had shown Elena earlier, wooden steps worn smooth by decades of use, leading to the stone-lined chamber that had sheltered 3 generations of his family from storms both natural and man-made. The trapdoor closed with a soft thud, leaving Sam alone in the gathering darkness. He moved through his house like a ghost, checking windows, testing locks, his hands remembering routines from a war he'd thought was finished. The rifle came naturally to his shoulder as he positioned himself at the front window, its scope revealing details the naked eye couldn't catch in the failing light. There, movement along the ridge, deliberate and coordinated. At least 3 men, possibly 4, spreading out in a tactical formation that spoke of military training. These weren't random drifters or opportunistic criminals. These were professionals. Sam's mouth went dry as he watched them work. They moved with the patient precision of hunters who knew their prey was trapped, taking their time to establish fields of fire and cut off escape routes. No rush, no mistakes, just methodical preparation for violence. The phone was dead when he tried it. Cut, not broken. The power would be next, once they were in position. Then they'd come in hard and fast, overwhelming any resistance before their targets could react. It was textbook assault tactics, and Sam recognized it because he'd used the same techniques himself a lifetime ago in the jungles of Southeast Asia. But this wasn't Vietnam, and these men had made one crucial miscalculation. They thought they were hunting refugees, a blind woman and 2 children who'd been running scared for weeks. They weren't prepared for what Sam Garrett had been before grief hollowed him out and turned him into a hermit. The lights went out at 8:17, plunging the house into darkness. Sam had been counting on it. He'd spent the last hour moving through his home in the dark, memorizing every shadow, every piece of furniture that could provide cover. When the blackout came, he was ready. The first shot shattered his living room window, a precise sniper's bullet that would have taken his head off if he'd been standing where they expected. Instead, Sam was already moving, using the muzzle flash to triangulate the shooter's position. 200 yards, slightly elevated, firing from behind the old water tank that marked his property's southern boundary. He didn't return fire immediately. Let them think they'd missed because of darkness or luck. Let them come closer. The front door exploded inward 3 minutes later, blown off its hinges by a shotgun blast that sent splinters flying like shrapnel. 2 figures in dark clothing rushed through the opening, moving with the practiced coordination of a team that had done this before. Sam let them come, pressed flat against the wall behind Margaret's old china cabinet. When they passed his position, he took the first one with the rifle butt to the base of the skull, dropping him instantly. The second spun toward the sound, but Sam was already inside his guard, close enough that training trumped youth and desperation. The man went down hard, his weapon clattering across the floor. "Room's clear," Sam called out in the voice of the man he'd just disabled, buying himself precious seconds. But the sniper on the ridge wasn't fooled. The next shot punched through the back wall of the house, close enough that Sam felt the wind of its passing. They knew he was armed now, knew he was dangerous. The easy takedown had become a siege. From beneath the kitchen floor, he could hear Michael crying, soft, muffled sounds that cut through Sam's chest like knife blades. The boy was scared, probably didn't understand why their game had turned real, why the nice man who'd given them blocks to play with was now fighting for their lives. That's when Sam Garrett felt something crack open inside his chest, something that had been sealed away for 20 years. Not just anger. He'd lived with anger since the night he lost everything. This was something deeper, more primal. This was the rage of a father whose children were threatened, the fury of a protector whose family was under attack. For the first time in 2 decades, Sam wasn't fighting just to survive. He was fighting for something worth living for. The rage sustained him for exactly 47 minutes. That was how long it took for the remaining attackers to regroup, call in reinforcements, and turn his desperate stand into a hopeless last gasp. Sam had managed to keep them at bay through sheer fury and intimate knowledge of his own property, but fury couldn't stop bullets, and knowledge couldn't multiply ammunition. When his rifle clicked empty, the sound echoed through the shattered remains of his kitchen like a death knell. Sam ejected the spent magazine and reached for the spare rounds he'd positioned on the counter, but a sniper's bullet took the box apart before his fingers could close on it. Brass cartridges scattered across Margaret's old linoleum like golden tears, each one representing another second of life he couldn't protect. From the ridge, a voice called out through an electric megaphone, "Samuel Garrett, we know you're in there. We know you have the woman and children. Send them out and we'll make this quick." The calm professionalism in that voice was worse than shouting would have been. These men weren't angry or desperate. They were simply doing a job. Elena and the twins weren't people to them, just objectives to be collected and problems to be solved. Sam pressed his back against the wall beside the kitchen window, .45 pistol heavy in his hands. 6 rounds left, maybe 7 if he'd miscounted in the chaos. Not nearly enough. "We can wait all night," the voice continued, "but every minute you delay makes this harder on everyone, especially the children." The threat hit Sam like a physical blow. Below his feet, he could hear movement in the root cellar, Elena's voice, soft and soothing, trying to keep Sarah and Michael calm as their world collapsed around them. She was singing something, a lullaby he almost recognized, her words barely audible through the floorboards. That's when Sam realized with crystalline clarity that he was going to die tonight. The knowledge should have terrified him. Instead, it brought an odd sort of peace. He'd been living on borrowed time for 20 years anyway, ever since the night his real family died and left him a hollow shell pretending to be a man. If death came now, at least it would come while protecting something precious. At least it would have meaning. But his death wouldn't save them. That was the bitter arithmetic of his situation. 6 bullets couldn't stop 4 trained killers, and once he was gone, Elena and the children would be defenseless. His sacrifice would buy them minutes at most, just long enough to understand they were trapped before the inevitable end. A shadow moved past the broken front window, testing his alertness. Sam fired once, rewarded by a curse and the sound of someone diving for cover. 5 rounds left. The megaphone crackled again. "That was stupid, old man. Now we do this the hard way." They came from 3 directions at once. Front door, back window, and the side entrance Sam had forgotten about in his tactical planning. The forgotten door, the one Margaret used for her garden, the one he hadn't secured because 20 years of solitude had made him careless about details that could kill you. The first figure through the garden door moved like liquid shadow, professional and precise. Sam put 2 bullets center mass, watching the man fold and drop, but the distraction cost him. The second attacker was already inside, rifle trained on Sam's position, finger tightening on the trigger. Time crystallized into amber slowness. Sam could see the muzzle flash blooming like a deadly flower, could track the bullet's path toward his chest with mathematical certainty. 3 rounds left in his pistol, but he'd never get the chance to fire them. This was how it ended then. Not in some foreign jungle or desert battlefield, but in his own kitchen, fighting for a family that couldn't possibly be real, but felt more genuine than anything he'd experienced since 1967. The bullet took him high in the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him against the refrigerator. His pistol clattered away into the darkness, disappearing under the kitchen table where he'd never reach it in time. Blood ran down his arm in warm streams, and his right shoulder felt like someone had driven a railroad spike through the joint. From below came the sound he'd been dreading, the root cellar door creaking open. Elena's voice, calling his name with desperate worry. "Stay down!" Sam tried to shout, but his voice came out as a strangled whisper. "Keep them safe!" The remaining attackers moved through his house like they owned it, weapons trained and ready. The one who'd shot him approached carefully, professional respect for a wounded enemy. In the darkness, Sam could make out tactical gear, night vision goggles, equipment that spoke of serious money behind this operation. "Where are they?" the man asked, voice muffled behind a tactical mask. Sam said nothing, conserving what strength he had left. Blood loss was making the room swim around him, but he could still hear Elena moving below, still feel the weight of his promise to protect them. The rifle butt caught him across the temple, sending bright stars cascading across his vision. When the world stopped spinning, 3 more figures had joined the first, all of them converging on the kitchen where the hidden entrance waited. "Found it," one of them said, kneeling beside the trap door. Root cellar, probably been here since the house was built. Sam's vision greyed at the edges as he watched them prepare to descend into the shelter where impossible children played with wooden blocks, while their mother sang lullabies against the dark. All his fury, all his determination, all his desperate love for a family that shouldn't exist, none of it had been enough. He'd failed them completely. The first man through the trapdoor never made it to the bottom. Sam heard the wet thud of impact, followed by a strangled cry that cut off abruptly. Then silence. The kind of absolute quiet that comes when violence happens so quickly the mind can't process it. Rodriguez? The team leader's voice carried a note of uncertainty for the first time. Rodriguez, report. No response came from the root cellar. Sam, bleeding against the refrigerator, watched the remaining 3 men exchange glances. Professional killers didn't spook easily, but something had just gone very wrong with their simple extraction mission. Could be a trap, one of them muttered. Spike pit, maybe. Old ranchers were paranoid about Indian raids. But Sam knew it wasn't any trap he'd built. The root cellar had been empty except for shelves of canned goods and a family that shouldn't exist. He thought of Elena's strange moments of knowing, how she'd found the hidden switch, navigated his house like she'd lived there for years, spoken about his dead wife with impossible intimacy. I'm going down, the team leader decided. Cover the entrance. Sam watched him descend into the darkness, tactical light cutting through shadows, weapon ready. For long minutes, nothing happened. Then came a sound that raised the hair on Sam's neck. A woman's voice, speaking words he couldn't quite hear in a tone that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards themselves. The tactical light went out. What the hell? One of the remaining men started. The scream that erupted from the cellar wasn't entirely human. It started as a man's voice full of terror and pain, but twisted into something else, something that spoke of fundamental wrongness, of reality bending in ways it was never meant to bend. The sound went on far longer than any throat should have been able to sustain it, rising and falling like a siren before cutting off with surgical abruptness. The 2 men left in the kitchen backed away from the trapdoor. Sam could see their hands shaking, their professional composure cracking like ice under pressure. We're leaving, the older one said. Radio for backup, air support if we can get it. What about the targets? Fuck the targets. This isn't what we signed up for. They retreated toward the front door, weapons still trained on the cellar entrance as if expecting something terrible to emerge. Sam wanted to warn them that running wouldn't help, that whatever was happening here went beyond tactics and bullets, but his voice wouldn't work. Blood loss was making everything swim around him, reality becoming as fluid as a fever dream. That's when Elena appeared at the top of the cellar stairs. She moved differently now. Not like the frightened, broken woman Sam had found in the mine shaft, but with a terrible purpose that seemed to bend the darkness around her. Her blind eyes reflected light that wasn't there, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made the air itself shiver. You came for us, she said to the fleeing men, but you don't understand what we are. The older mercenary spun and fired 3 quick shots center mass. The bullets passed through Elena like she was made of mist, striking the wall behind her without leaving so much as a mark on her clothing. Not possible, he whispered. Elena smiled, and Sam saw something in that expression that finally made all the impossible pieces click into place. The knowledge hit him like a physical blow, so devastating in its simplicity that he wondered how he'd missed it for so long. Elena wasn't hiding from these men because she was a refugee or a witness. She was hiding because she was dead. The woman he'd been protecting, the children he'd grown to love, they weren't refugees from some government program or escaped test subjects. They were echoes, impressions left behind by violence so profound it had torn holes in the fabric of things. Elena had died somewhere, somehow, along with 2 children who looked like his lost sons because grief had shaped them in his image. And Sam's 20 years of isolation, his guilt and longing, had called them here like a beacon in the dark. Sarah, Elena called softly. Michael, come say goodbye to the bad men. The children appeared at the cellar entrance, but they weren't the innocent toddlers who'd played with wooden blocks and laughed at silly songs. Their eyes held depths that belonged to no living child, and when they smiled, shadows seemed to smile with them. The mercenaries broke and ran, their carefully planned extraction dissolving into panicked flight. Sam heard vehicles starting outside, engines roaring as professional killers fled from something their training had never prepared them to face. In the sudden quiet, Elena turned to Sam with infinite sadness. "I'm sorry," she said. "I never wanted you to see us as we really are." The illusion was kinder. Sam looked at the woman he'd protected, the children he'd loved, and felt something shift deep in his chest. Not fear. He was beyond fear now. Understanding. After 20 years of haunting himself, he'd finally found ghosts worth being haunted by. "How long do we have?" he whispered. Elena knelt beside him, her touch cool against his fevered skin. "As long as you need, Sam. As long as you need." The bleeding stopped first. Sam felt the warmth fade from his shoulder wound, watched the crimson stains on his shirt darken and dry as if hours had passed in minutes. The pain remained, a deep, throbbing reminder of mortality, but the urgent flow of life leaving his body simply ceased. Elena's touch was like cool water against desert stone. Where her fingers traced the torn edges of his flesh, Sam felt something deeper than healing. Not the knitting of muscle and bone, but a fundamental strengthening, as if she were pouring resolve directly into his spirit. "The men who came tonight," Sam said, his voice steadier than it had any right to be, "they won't be the last." "No." Elena helped him sit up straighter against the refrigerator, her movements careful but no longer fragile. The terrified refugee who'd hidden in his mine shaft was gone, replaced by something far more substantial. "There will be others. They've been hunting us for a very long time." Sarah and Michael emerged fully from the root cellar, no longer bothering with the illusion of ordinary children. They moved like whispers given form, their two old eyes taking in the destruction of Sam's kitchen with detached curiosity. Michael crouched beside a fallen rifle, studying it with the scientific interest of someone who'd seen too much violence to be shocked by its tools. "Hunters," Sarah said, her small voice carrying weight that made the broken windows rattle. "They smell like the ones who hurt us before." The casual way she spoke of violence, of death, should have horrified Sam. Instead, he felt a fierce protectiveness rise in his chest. Whatever these beings were, ghosts, echoes, something between life and death, they were his now. His family in ways that transcended blood and breath. "Tell me," he said to Elena. "Tell me what really happened to you." She was quiet for a long moment, her blind gaze fixed on something only she could see. "We were running then too. From different hunters, but the same hunger, the same need to possess what they didn't understand." Her fingers found his, ice-cold but somehow comforting. "They caught us in a place between places, a laboratory built in sacred ground, where the walls were thin." "Sacred ground?" "An old Pueblo site, the kind of place where the dead don't stay buried, where grief can take on weight and substance." Elena's smile was terrible and sad. "We died there, Sam, all three of us, but your pain called us back." Sam understood now why the children looked like his lost sons, why Elena moved through his house like she'd always lived there. 20 years of guilt and longing had shaped them, given form to his deepest need for redemption. They were what his heart had carved from the space between worlds. A second chance wrapped in impossible flesh. "The hunters know what you are? They know we're not alive. But they don't understand that makes us stronger, not weaker." Elena stood, and shadows moved with her like loyal dogs. "They think death is an ending. They don't realize it can be a beginning." Michael picked up one of the scattered brass cartridges from Sam's destroyed ammunition, rolling it between his fingers like a marble. "We could make them go away forever," he said conversationally. "The way we made the others go away." The boy's matter-of-fact tone sent a chill through Sam's blood. He'd watched professional killers flee in terror from whatever these children had become, had seen men who'd probably faced death a dozen times break and run like scared rabbits. The power contained in these small forms was beyond anything human weapons could counter. But Sam had spent too many years drowning in guilt to let darkness consume another family, even one already claimed by death. "No," he said firmly. "We don't become monsters to fight monsters." Elena turned toward him, surprise flickering across her features. "Sam?" I said no. He struggled to his feet, using the refrigerator for support. His shoulder screamed in protest, but he remained upright through sheer will. "There's another way. There has to be." Sarah tilted her head, studying him with ancient eyes. "You would protect them? The ones who came to hurt us?" "I'd protect us," Sam corrected, "from becoming something we can't live with, even if living means something different now." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of 20 years' worth of choices Sam couldn't unmake. Outside, dawn was still hours away, but he could feel the night changing around them. The hunters would regroup, would come back with different weapons, different plans, but they'd also carry fear now, the bone-deep terror of men who'd glimpsed something beyond their understanding. That fear could be used, not as a weapon, but as a tool for something better. "We need to disappear," Sam said finally. "All of us. Find a place where the living and the dead can exist without hunting or being hunted." Elena's smile was the first truly peaceful expression he'd seen cross her face. "You're asking us to trust you, even knowing what we are." Sam looked at his impossible family. Ghost woman, shadow children, and one broken man who'd finally found something worth protecting again. "I'm asking you to let me earn that trust." The eastern horizon held no promise of dawn yet, but Sam could feel time pressing against them like a physical weight. His shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, a metronome marking the precious minutes they had before the hunters regrouped and returned with reinforcements. "We can't stay here," he said, surveying the wreckage of his kitchen. Bullet holes marked the walls like constellations of violence, and the smell of cordite hung in the air alongside something else, something that reminded him of winter mornings and distant thunder. "This place is blown. They'll come back with everything they've got." Elena nodded, her fingers trailing along the edge of the kitchen table, where 20 years of solitary meals had worn the wood smooth. "You're asking us to leave the only anchor we have. This house, your grief, it's what keeps us solid in your world. Then we'll find another anchor." Sam moved carefully toward the window, peering through the shattered glass at the desert beyond. No lights, no movement, but that meant nothing. Professional hunters knew how to wait. There are places in this country where the government doesn't ask questions, where people who need to disappear can make new lives. Sarah appeared beside him with that unnerving silence only the dead could manage. "The bad men will follow us anywhere we go. They have machines that see in the dark, voices that carry across the sky." Her small hand touched his arm, cold as winter stone. "We've been running for so long, Sam. Before we found you, we ran through places that don't have names." The weight of her words settled into his bones. These weren't ordinary refugees fleeing ordinary persecution. They were something caught between worlds, hunted by forces that treated the impossible as just another problem to be solved with bullets and body bags. But Sam had been a soldier once, had learned that every enemy, no matter how well equipped or ruthless, had weaknesses that could be exploited. The fear he'd seen in those mercenaries' eyes wasn't tactical vulnerability, it was something deeper, more primal. They'd encountered power that operated outside their understanding of reality, and that confusion could be leveraged. "Pack light," he told Elena. "Only what we absolutely need. We've got maybe an hour before they call in support." Michael emerged from the root cellar carrying the wooden blocks Sam had carved for him, clutching them against his small chest like talismans. "Are we going to find a new place to hide?" "We're going to find a place where we don't need to hide," Sam corrected. He pulled his emergency kit from beneath the sink. Cash, documents, ammunition he'd hoped never to need again. 20 years of paranoid preparation finally proving its worth. "But first, we're going to send a message." Elena's blind eyes tracked his movement with uncanny precision. "What kind of message?" Sam loaded fresh cartridges into his pistol, muscle memory from decades past guiding his hands, the kind that makes our hunters think twice about following us. They're scared now, but scared men make desperate choices. We need them terrified. You said we wouldn't become monsters, Sarah reminded him. We won't, but they don't know that. Sam holstered the weapon and began gathering supplies. Water, food, medical kit, everything they'd need for a journey into uncertainty. Fear is about what people imagine might happen, not what actually happens. Right now, those men are imagining all sorts of horrors. We just need to encourage their creativity. Elena moved through the house with the confidence of someone who'd lived there for decades rather than days, collecting the few possessions that mattered. A worn photograph Sam had shared, the children's toys, the remnants of their brief attempt at normalcy. Each item she touched seemed to shimmer slightly, as if her attention was what kept them real. There's a place, she said quietly. Something Sarah remembers from before we died. A sanctuary where the boundaries are thinner, where beings like us can exist without pretense. She paused in her gathering, her expression distant. But getting there means crossing territory controlled by worse things than government hunters. Worse how? Things that were never human to begin with. Old things that see us as trespassers in the spaces between life and death. Sam shouldered his pack, testing the weight against his injured shoulder. The pain was manageable. Elena's touch had done more than stop the bleeding. It had given him strength he hadn't felt in 20 years. Then we'd better get moving before our current problems decide to work together. The first pale hint of dawn touched the mountains as they prepared to leave the only home any of them had known. Sam took one last look at the kitchen where he'd shared impossible meals with an impossible family, where bullet holes now marked the walls like evidence of a dream turned nightmare. Outside, engines rumbled in the distance. Low, purposeful sounds that spoke of incoming force. The hunters were returning, bringing friends. Sam opened the door and stepped into the desert darkness, followed by 3 shadows that had learned to love him. Behind them, the house stood empty and broken, holding nothing but echoes of what might have been. The real journey was just beginning. The desert floor was still warm from yesterday's sun, but Sam could feel the temperature dropping as they moved away from the ranch. Each step took them further from the only anchor Elena and the children had known in this world, and he could sense them becoming less solid with every yard of distance. "Stay close," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to them or himself. Elena's hand found his arm, her touch lighter than it had been in the house, but still reassuringly present. The sanctuary Sarah remembers. It's called the Between Place. An old trading post built where 3 territories meet, where the Apache and Navajo and Spanish all claimed the same ground, but none could hold it. Contested territory, Sam nodded, the kind of place that falls through bureaucratic cracks. More than that, the competing claims, the spilled blood, the refusal of any one people to surrender it completely, all of that created something unique, a space that belongs to the living and the dead equally. Behind them, the rumble of engines grew closer. Sam counted at least 6 vehicles, maybe more. The hunters had called in serious reinforcement. Red and blue lights painted the distant sagebrush, suggesting they'd brought federal backup to legitimize whatever they found at his ranch. "How far?" Sam asked. 3 days on foot through the hardest country this desert has to offer," Elena replied. "Assuming we can avoid both the living and the dead who guard the approaches." Michael appeared at Sam's elbow like a whisper given form. "The old things don't like us much. They think we're cheaters." "Cheaters?" Sarah materialized on his other side, her small hand cold against his wrist. "We came back from death but kept too much of life. The old ones say that's not how the rules work." Sam felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. In 20 years of isolation, he'd convinced himself that grief and guilt were the worst things a man could carry. But Elena and her children existed in a space between worlds where far older, more fundamental forces held sway, forces that viewed their existence as a violation of natural law. "Then we'll have to convince them otherwise," he said with more confidence than he felt. The first real test came sooner than expected. They'd been walking for barely an hour when the air ahead of them began to shimmer like heat mirages, though the night was growing steadily colder. Sam raised his hand, calling a halt. "What is it?" Elena asked, but her tone suggested she already knew. "Company," Sarah whispered. "The kind that never breathed." The shimmer resolved into shapes, vaguely human figures made of dust and starlight, and something that hurt to look at directly. They stood across the path like a checkpoint, neither advancing nor retreating, waiting. Sam felt every instinct he'd learned in 40 years of hard living scream at him to run. These things radiated wrongness on a cellular level, made his vision blur and his heart stutter with proximity alone. But running would mean abandoning Elena and the children to face judgment from beings that had no concept of mercy. Instead, he stepped forward. "You're trespassing," one of the figures said without moving its mouth. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, like wind through broken glass. "We're traveling," Sam replied steadily. "Seeking sanctuary. The dead alive ones have no right to passage. They broke the covenant." "What covenant?" Elena's voice came from directly behind him, though he hadn't heard her approach. "The agreement between worlds. Death is supposed to be permanent. By returning, by loving and being loved, we've compromised the boundary." Sam felt the weight of 20 years' worth of choices settling on his shoulders. His grief had called these beings back from whatever lay beyond, had given them form and purpose in defiance of natural law. Now that same love that had saved him was marking them for destruction. "The children didn't choose this," he said to the waiting figures. "Neither did Elena. If someone broke your covenant, it was me." The entities moved closer, their not quite human faces turning toward him with terrible interest. "You claim responsibility?" "I claim everything. The calling, the keeping, the loving." Sam's hand found the pistol at his side, knowing it was useless but needing the comfort of familiar weight. "If there's a price to be paid, I'll pay it." The silence that followed stretched like a held breath. Behind them, the distant lights of the hunting party swept across the desert floor, growing steadily brighter. Ahead, beings older than human civilization debated the fate of 4 souls caught between one world and the next. Sam stood at the center of it all, finally understanding that this had always been where his path was leading, not to redemption or forgiveness, but to this moment when he would have to choose between the safety of cosmic order and the impossible family that grief had carved from shadows. The final test had begun. The entities circled closer, their forms shifting like smoke given malevolent purpose. Sam could feel their attention pressing against him, weighing his soul with the patience of beings who had watched civilizations rise and crumble into dust. "You would trade your essence for their continued existence." The voice scraped against his mind like rusted metal. "Understand, mortal, this is not death as your kind knows it. This is unmaking, complete erasure from all worlds, all possibilities." Sam's throat went dry, but his voice held steady. "I understand." "Sam, no." Elena's hand found his shoulder, her touch suddenly burning cold. "This isn't your burden to bear. We chose to answer your call. We chose to love you back. You didn't choose anything," he said without turning around. "I pulled you from whatever peace you'd found because I was too selfish to let go." The truth of it carved through him like a blade. My wife, my boys, they moved on to whatever comes next, but I held on to the pain, made it into something that could reach across death itself. Behind them, the hunting party's lights had grown close enough to illuminate individual vehicles. Sam could hear engines cutting out, doors slamming, the harsh bark of tactical communications. They had minutes, maybe less, before trained killers converged on their position with weapons designed to end whatever they couldn't understand. The lead entity drifted closer, and Sam caught glimpses of what it might have been: ancient stone worn smooth by desert winds, stars that had died when the earth was young, the hollow spaces where rain had never fallen. The hunters seek to capture them, to study them, to weaponize the boundary breach they represent. I know. Yet you would sacrifice yourself rather than allow them to be taken? Sam finally looked back at Elena and the children. Sarah and Michael stood like small sentinels flanking their mother, their two old eyes reflecting depths of experience no child should possess. Elena's face was turned toward him with an expression of desperate love and terrible understanding. They were fading. The distance from his ranch, the presence of the entities, the approach of dawn, all of it was pulling them back toward whatever realm they'd emerged from. Soon they would be nothing but whispers again, memories without substance, and he would be alone with 20 years of accumulated guilt and the knowledge that he'd failed another family. "Yeah," Sam said. "I would." The entity that had been speaking moved until it stood directly in front of him. Up close, it smelled like ozone and ancient bone, like the moment before lightning strikes. "This love you claim, explain its nature." "I don't know how to explain love to something that's never felt it." Sam met what might have been eyes in the creature's shifting face. "They gave me back pieces of myself I thought were gone forever. Not my wife and sons, I know they're not them, but the part of me that could be a father again, a husband, a man who protects instead of just surviving. And for this, you would accept oblivion." The hunting party was close enough now that Sam could hear individual voices, the metallic sounds of weapons being readied. Flashlight beams swept the desert in expanding arcs, searching for the impossible family that had vanished from the damaged ranch house. "The way I see it," Sam said, "I've been in oblivion for 20 years already. At least this time it means something." The entities drew back, conferring in voices like wind through empty canyons. Elena stepped beside Sam, her form flickering but her presence still warm against the desert cold. "There's another way," she said quietly, "but it requires us to become something else entirely, not alive, not dead, but truly between." "What does that mean?" Sarah appeared at his other side, her small hand slipping into his. "It means we stop pretending to be human. Stop trying to fit into your world or the world we came from." Michael nodded gravely. "It means we become guardians of the space between spaces, protectors of other lost souls." The lead entity turned back toward them, and Sam caught a flicker of something that might have been approval in its shifting features. The broken ones seek to merge the worlds, to eliminate the boundaries that keep order intact. Such an incursion requires response. "You're offering us a job," Sam realized. "We offer purpose. The hunters who pursue you are symptoms of a larger corruption. Others, like your family, exist, beings caught between life and death by trauma, by love, by refusal to accept endings. They require protection from those who would exploit them." Elena's hand found Sam's free one, completing a circle of connection that suddenly blazed with possibility. A chance to help others like us, to make the violation of natural law into something that serves justice. The hunting party crested the rise behind them, tactical lights sweeping across the desert floor. In moments they would be spotted, captured, separated, Elena and the children dragged away to laboratories, while Sam faced charges he couldn't fight. But the entities were offering something else, a transformation that would place them forever beyond the reach of merely human threats. Guardians of the lost, protectors of the impossible, enforcers of a justice that transcended the boundaries between worlds. Sam looked at his impossible family and made his choice. Yes. The moment Sam spoke his acceptance, the world exploded into light. Not the harsh white beams of the hunters' tactical lights, but something deeper, starfire and moonfall and the aurora that danced at the edge of forever. The light poured through him, around him, remaking every cell with surgical precision that felt like being born and dying simultaneously. He could hear Elena crying out, the children's voices joining hers in harmonies that belonged to no earthly language. But their sounds weren't fear. They were recognition, welcome, the joy of finally coming home to a place they'd never known existed. The transformation burned. Sam felt his human limitations peeling away like old paint, felt the arthritis in his joints dissolve along with the scar tissue from decades of ranch work and the persistent ache in his shoulder where the hunter's bullet had found its mark. But with each layer of mortality that fell away, something else was added, awareness that stretched beyond the confines of flesh, senses that could perceive the spaces between heartbeats, between thoughts, between worlds. Through the blazing chrysalis of change, he could see the hunting party frozen like insects in amber. Their weapons hung useless in their hands as they stared at the pillar of impossible light that had erupted from empty desert. Fear etched their faces, not the tactical concern of professionals encountering unexpected resistance, but the primal terror of creatures suddenly confronted with forces beyond their comprehension. Good, Sam thought, and was surprised to discover his thoughts now carried weight that could reshape reality. The hunters' vehicles began to sink into sand that moments before had been solid ground. Their communications equipment sparked and died. Their memories of this night would fade like half-remembered nightmares, leaving only a conviction that some territories were not meant to be explored. The light began to fade, and Sam looked down at hands that were still his own, but somehow more. His skin held depths like still water, and when he moved, trails of starlight followed his gestures. Elena stood beside him, transformed into something that married blindness with sight. Her eyes now held the color of deep space, and Sam knew she could see everything that mattered across all possible worlds. Sarah and Michael had become something beautiful and terrible, children who carried the wisdom of ancient things while retaining the fierce protectiveness that only the young could possess. They were no longer bound by the physical limitations that had defined their brief first lives, but they were still unmistakably themselves, still his children in all the ways that mattered. The lead entity approached them, its form now easier to perceive with their enhanced senses. What Sam had taken for malevolence was actually something far more complex. Duty worn smooth by eons, purpose refined to its essential core. "You understand the cost," it said, and now Sam could hear the deep sadness that underlied its words. "You will exist between all worlds and belong fully to none. You will protect others like yourselves, but you can never again claim the simple peace of purely human existence." Sam felt the weight of that sacrifice settling into his transformed bones. No more quiet mornings on the ranch. No more simple pleasures of coffee and sunrise and the satisfaction of honest work. No more pretending that Elena and the children were just an unusual family seeking refuge in the desert. They had become something else entirely. Guardians of the lost, shepherds of souls caught between life and death by trauma too great to accept conventional endings. They would spend eternity walking the spaces between worlds, finding others like themselves and protecting them from those who would exploit the impossible for mundane gain. It was not the life Sam had imagined when he'd first discovered Elena bleeding in that mine shaft. It was not the quiet redemption he'd hoped grief might eventually grant him. But as he looked at his impossible family, truly his now in ways that transcended biology or law or even death, he knew it was exactly what they were meant to become. Elena's hand slipped into his, solid and warm despite their transformation. "No more hiding," she said softly. "No more running," Sarah added, her voice carrying harmonics that made the desert flowers bloom out of season. "No more fear," Michael concluded, and Sam felt the last of his merely human concerns fall away like shed skin. The entities were already fading, their purpose completed. The hunting party stumbled through sand dunes that had swallowed their vehicles, their memories fragmenting with each confused step. Dawn was breaking over mountains that suddenly seemed smaller, less significant, part of just one world among infinite possibilities. Sam squeezed Elena's hand and felt her squeeze back, not with the desperate grip of someone afraid of fading away, but with the confident touch of a partner ready for whatever came next. Together they took their first steps into a transformed existence, followed by children who had learned that some loves were strong enough to break every rule the universe had ever written. Behind them, the empty desert held no trace of what had transpired, but ahead lay all the lost souls who needed what only they could provide, proof that love could indeed transcend the boundaries between life and death. The first thing Sam noticed was the silence, not the absence of sound, but a deeper quiet that seemed to absorb the chaos of transformation and metabolize it into something like peace. The desert morning stretched before them, painted in colors that his enhanced vision could now perceive in all their impossible complexity. Each grain of sand held stories written in light. Each shadow carried whispers from worlds he was only beginning to understand. Elena stood beside him, her transformed features catching the early sunlight like a prism. Where her blindness had once been a barrier, Sam could see it had become something else entirely, a different way of perceiving that allowed her to navigate the spaces between realities with perfect clarity. She was beautiful in ways that transcended human concepts of beauty, but she was still Elena, still the woman who had cradled her children in a flooded mineshaft, who had trusted him enough to reveal impossible truths. "How do we feel?" she asked, her voice carrying new harmonics that made the morning air shimmer. Sam took inventory of his transformed body. The constant ache in his lower back was gone, along with the stiffness in his knees that had reminded him every morning of 58 years of hard living. But more than physical changes, he felt a completeness he hadn't experienced since Mary and the boys had died. The gnawing emptiness that had defined 2 decades of existence had been filled with purpose so profound it frightened him. "Different," he said finally. "Like I've been walking around wearing clothes that never quite fit, and someone finally gave me something made for my actual size." Sarah materialized beside them, her small form flickering between solid and translucent as she adjusted to her new nature. "I can hear them," she said, wonder coloring her voice. "All the lost ones. They're calling." Michael nodded, his expression carrying the gravity of an adult despite his child's features. "There's a woman in Colorado who's been talking to her dead husband through radio static. Men in black suits are coming for her tomorrow." Sam felt the information settle into his consciousness like a memory he'd always possessed. Somehow, through their transformation, they had been connected to a network of impossible souls, people whose grief or trauma or sheer refusal to accept loss had created bridges between worlds. Each one was vulnerable to exploitation by those who would turn mystery into weapon. "Then we'd better get moving," he said, surprised at how natural it felt to accept this new responsibility. Elena's hand found his, and he marveled at how solid she felt despite their fundamental change. "Are you afraid?" she asked. The question stopped him. 20 years ago he would have said yes without hesitation. Fear had been his constant companion since the night the state trooper had knocked on his door with news that would shatter his world into fragments. Fear of being alone, fear of forgetting Mary's voice, fear that his boys would become nothing more than fading photographs on a mantle. But standing here in the transformed desert, surrounded by family that existed in defiance of every natural law, Sam realized the fear was gone, not because there was nothing left to lose, but because he finally understood that some things, the important things, could never truly be lost at all. "No," he said, and meant it. "For the first time in 20 years, I'm not afraid." The ranch, where they'd spent their brief time as something resembling a normal family, was already fading from relevance. The hunting party would find nothing but an empty house and equipment failures that would take months to explain. The official reports would mention atmospheric anomalies and equipment malfunctions, carefully avoiding any reference to the impossible family that had vanished without a trace. But Sam felt no sadness at leaving it behind. The ranch had been a way station, a place where he could learn to be human again before accepting the responsibility of becoming something more. Elena and the children had given him that gift, the knowledge that love didn't end at death, that family could be forged from anything strong enough to reach across the void between worlds. "Where do we start?" he asked. Sarah pointed northwest, toward mountains that shimmered with heat even in the cool morning air. "She's there, the radio woman, but she's not the only one." Michael's young face grew solemn. "There are others. A man who sees his daughter in every reflection, twins who speak in languages that died with civilizations, children who remember being someone else entirely." Each name, each story, settled into Sam's awareness like pieces of a vast puzzle. Their new existence would be spent traveling between worlds, finding these lost souls and protecting them from those who would exploit the impossible. It was work that would span eternity, work that required beings who understood loss intimately enough to recognize it in others. Elena squeezed his hand, and Sam felt the last of his uncertainty dissolve. Together, they began walking toward the mountains, followed by children who carried starlight in their eyes and purpose in their impossible hearts. Behind them, the desert held no trace of their passage, but ahead lay all the broken souls who needed to know that love could indeed transcend death itself. The work was just beginning. The return. 3 months later, Sam Garrett sat in a roadside diner outside Durango, Colorado, watching steam rise from his untouched coffee as Elena fed Michael pieces of scrambled eggs. To anyone observing them, they looked like a perfectly ordinary family. A weathered rancher, his blind wife, their young twins sharing a booth by the window. The waitress had smiled at the children, commented on their remarkable resemblance to their father, and never noticed that their eyes held depths that belonged to ancient stars. Sam marveled at how seamlessly they moved through the human world now. Their transformed nature allowed them to appear as solid and normal as any other family when necessary, while maintaining their ability to slip between realities when their true work called. They had learned to modulate their presence, to dim the otherworldly light that surrounded them until it registered only as an unusual warmth, a subtle magnetism that drew troubled souls without alarming the mundane world. The radio woman, Dorothy Martinez, 63, widowed 18 months, had been easier to help than Sam had expected. When they'd found her in her isolated cabin, surrounded by government equipment and speaking frantically into dead air, her relief at seeing them had been overwhelming. She had known instantly what they were, recognizing kindred spirits who existed in the spaces between grief and acceptance. "You're like me," she had whispered, tears streaming down her lined face. "You're proof I'm not going crazy." They had spent 2 weeks teaching Dorothy how to shield her communications with her deceased husband, Carlos, from electronic detection, how to recognize the signs of unwanted attention, and most importantly, how to accept that her impossible gift was not a symptom of madness, but evidence of love strong enough to transcend death. By the time they left, she was no longer broadcasting her conversations to the world, and the government teams tracking her transmissions had found only static. Sarah looked up from her coloring book, her crayon pausing mid-stroke. "The man with the mirrors is close," she said quietly, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone she used when accessing their supernatural awareness. Sam nodded, unsurprised. Thomas Brennan lived 40 miles north, a carpenter whose 5-year-old daughter had died in a house fire 6 months ago. Ever since, he had been seeing her reflection in every mirror, every window, every surface that could hold an image. The visions were driving him toward a breakdown that would inevitably attract attention from those who collected the impossible. Elena tilted her head in that particular way that meant she was sensing something beyond normal perception. "He's planning to destroy every mirror in his house tonight. He thinks if he eliminates all the reflective surfaces, she'll finally find peace." "But that's not how it works," Michael said solemnly, his small hand reaching for his orange juice. "She's not trapped in the mirrors. She's trying to tell him something." Over the past 3 months, Sam had learned to trust his family's supernatural insights completely. Sarah and Michael possessed an intuitive understanding of the boundary between worlds that complemented Elena's ability to navigate those spaces directly. Together, they formed a perfect unit for finding and protecting souls caught between life and death. More importantly, Sam had learned to trust himself in ways he never could as a merely human man. The transformation had burned away not just his physical limitations, but the crushing guilt that had defined his existence since Mary and the boys died. He still remembered his family with profound love, but the corrosive self-blame that had poisoned 20 years of his life was gone, replaced by an understanding that some tragedies existed beyond anyone's ability to prevent or control. "We should go to him tonight," Sam said, finishing his coffee in one swallow. The liquid tasted different now. He could perceive layers of flavor that revealed the water's origin, the soil that had nurtured the beans, the hopes and worries of everyone who had handled it along the way to his cup. Everything carried stories now, and Sam had learned to read them all. Elena smiled, the expression transforming her already beautiful features into something that made the diner's fluorescent lights seem suddenly inadequate. "You've changed," she said softly. "How so?" 3 months ago you would have asked if we should help him. Now you simply state that we will. You've stopped questioning your right to make those decisions." Sam considered this as he left money on the table, more than enough to cover their meal and provide a generous tip for the waitress who had been kind to the children. Elena was right. Somewhere during their travels, he had stopped feeling like an imposter playing at being a guardian and started simply being one. The authority came naturally now, as much a part of his transformed nature as his enhanced senses or ability to exist between worlds. They walked into the Colorado afternoon, a family that belonged fully to no single reality but served as bridges between all of them. Behind them, the diner continued its ordinary business, while ahead waited Thomas Brennan and his desperate need to understand that love could manifest in impossible ways. Sam felt the familiar stirring of purpose as they began their journey north. This was who they had become, shepherds of the lost, protectors of love that refused to die. It was better than any life he had dared imagine, the new beginning. 1 year later, Sam Garrett stood in the garden behind a small house in Taos, watching Sarah and Michael chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. The adobe walls held the day's warmth like a gentle embrace, and somewhere inside, Elena was humming an old song while she prepared their evening meal. To any neighbor who might glance over the low fence, they looked like any other family settling into the rhythm of an ordinary evening. But ordinary had become an elastic concept in their transformed existence. The house had appeared in their lives the way most things did now, through a convergence of need and possibility that transcended conventional real estate transactions. An elderly woman named Rosa had left it to whoever needs it most in a will that defied legal logic, and somehow the keys had found their way to Elena's hands during their travels through northern New Mexico. The deed bore their names in ink that shimmered like starlight when viewed from certain angles. It served as their base between journeys, a place where they could exist as something approaching a normal family while remaining connected to the network of lost souls who needed their protection. The garden bloomed in impossible colors year-round, and the neighbors had stopped commenting on how the Garrett family never seemed to age, how their children's laughter carried echoes that made listeners smile without understanding why. Sam knelt beside a row of tomatoes that should have been dormant in December, but continued producing fruit that tasted like summer memories. His hands, still weathered but no longer purely human, worked the rich soil, while his enhanced senses monitored the invisible currents that connected their small sanctuary to the larger world of the lost. 3 new ones this week, Elena said, stepping onto the back porch with a dish towel in her hands. A teacher in Montana who sees her students' futures, twins in Oregon who shared dreams with children who died 50 years ago, and a rancher in Wyoming who talks to horses that aren't there anymore, Sam finished, standing and brushing earth from his knees. The information had reached him the same way it always did, filtering through their supernatural awareness like whispers on a wind that existed between worlds. The rancher first, he's the most vulnerable. It had taken him months to understand how their new existence worked. They weren't bound to any single location or limited by conventional travel. When duty called, they could step between worlds and emerge wherever they were needed most. But they had learned the value of this small house, this brief sanctuary where they could remember what it felt like to be human while accepting the responsibility of being something more. Sarah ran to him, her small arms wrapping around his waist with a force that would have knocked his merely human self backward. "Can we take the truck this time, Papa? I like watching the mountains change." The word still sent warmth flooding through Sam's chest. Papa. It had emerged naturally from both children's vocabularies, as if their transformed existence had granted them access to the relationship that death had stolen 20 years ago. They were not Mary's twins reborn. Sam had learned to understand the distinction, but they were his children in all the ways that mattered, claimed through bonds stronger than biology. Michael appeared at Sarah's side, fireflies creating a gentle constellation in the glass jar he carried. "The Wyoming man has been alone for 37 years, he said, with a solemn gravity that sometimes made Sam forget he was looking at a child. "He thinks he's going crazy." "Then we'll show him he's not," Elena said, settling into the porch swing that Sam had built from lumber that never seemed to weather despite New Mexico's harsh climate. "We'll help him understand that love doesn't end just because breathing does." Sam looked at his impossible family and felt the familiar surge of purpose that had defined this new existence. 12 souls protected in the past year. 12 people who had learned they weren't insane, weren't broken, weren't alone in their ability to maintain connections that transcended death itself. Each success had deepened his understanding of what they had become. Not just guardians of the lost, but proof that love could indeed reshape reality. The old Sam Garrett, the man who had spent 20 years drowning in guilt and whiskey, felt like someone he had known in another life. The ache of loss was still there, but it had been transformed from a wound that never healed into a source of strength that allowed him to recognize similar pain in others. Mary's death, the boys' deaths, they remained profound sorrows, but they were no longer defining limitations. As stars began to emerge in the deepening sky, Sam felt Elena's hand slip into his, solid, warm, real in ways that transcended physical existence. Around them, the garden hummed with life that bloomed outside conventional seasons, and in the distance, he could sense the rancher in Wyoming preparing for another sleepless night of conversations, with horses only he could see. Tomorrow, they would begin another journey. Tonight, they were simply a family sharing the profound peace that came from knowing their love would never end. It was more than enough. It was everything.